Hello and welcome to Breaking Down, the series where we take an in-depth look at a Fire Emblem unit from a gameplay perspective. Today we will be looking at member of House Goneril and sister of Holst, Hilda. Before we start, I would like to thank the people who have backed the channel on Patreon, where for just £1 a month you can see the units that will be in this season of Breaking Down, as well as vote on the next unit from that list to be released. More on this at the end. Whilst this series is not focused around plot, there is always a chance for spoilers, and certain elements of the game and its structure and story will inevitably be mentioned, so if that is a concern for you, feel free to give it a miss. Also, where relevant, this is considering the maddening difficulty on a regular new game file with no exploits or excessive grinding. Hilda is a member of the Golden Deer House, so should you choose to teach them with Byleth, you will have access to her from the get-go. Otherwise, well, it gets a little weird. In the Blue Lines, you can recruit her as a normal unit, just as you would any other. The easiest way to do this is to raise her support to B, at which point she can request to join your house on any day following this. Outside of this, her recruit requirements are in Axes and Charm, with the specifics varying based on Byleth's support with Hilda, and those are shown on screen now. Those of you who are familiar with other units here may be thinking that these seem absurdly high, and they are. Reaching these in a timely fashion will probably require a lot more effort than just getting her B support, so if you want to grab her, I'd recommend just doing that. Silver Snow is also an awkward recruitment, since she doesn't become available until Chapter 12, but unlike other late unlocks in this route such as Cyril, Catherine and Seteth, Hilda still has to be recruited as normal. The issue here is that the ways in which you could raise Byleth's support with her throughout the rest of Part 1 have been more limited, since until choosing to side with the Church, you have been unable to give her gifts, take her on mission assistance, or return her lost items. You also only have a 2-week period in which to recruit her, which is not long at all. Fortunately, you are free to dump as many gifts on her as you want at this point in time, so raising the support rank is very possible to do very quickly. You are also likely to have gone into Brigand with Byleth by now, meaning their axes will be already at least the D+ mark. They are also likely to be around 16 to 20 charm just naturally from growths, assuming they level normally and are somewhere between level 20 and 25, however you have also had a lot of opportunity to do tea parties which can raise Byleth's charm by this point, even if you only did them on birthdays. Due to this, you should be able to hit the requirements for the C+ support recruitment without too much trouble. I do believe Hilda can still be recruited through auto-joining in Silver Snow with a B support, but I'm not 100% certain, since by then you should definitely already have the requirements anyway. If you opt to side with Edelgard and go down the Crimson Flower route, Hilda is not available at all. Hilda's personal ability is Advocate, or Advocate. I'm not sure which it's meant to be, I usually go with the former. This gives 3 damage to Hilda's adjacent male allies. This is a very strong ability with the potential to provide massive amounts of additional damage each turn, especially since its benefits can be enjoyed on both the player and enemy phase. Things such as doubling with the adjacent males or making use of weapons or combat arts that guarantee this, such as gauntlets, allow this to be further taken advantage of. Even without particularly trying, this will prove very useful, but if you actively plan around this, the amount of extra damage this can give can be a huge boost to your team each turn, particularly in the early game where 3 damage holds a lot more relevance and can be a lot harder to come by. Just bear in mind that you can take advantage of this both before and after Hilda moves each turn, so seeing if you can exploit this before moving Hilda herself can grant a lot of additional opportunities to let this boost come through and really let Advocate shine. Hilda does also possess a Crest, and this is the Minor Crest of Goneril. This gives her a 30% chance to prevent enemy counterattacks when using combat arts. All in all, I think this one is pretty nice. It's controllable thanks to the combat art condition, occurs pretty frequently with a 30% activation rate, and the effect will very rarely have downsides or drawbacks when you don't want it to proc. As with all crests, this also allows Hilda to use relics without taking any additional damage, and alongside this, there is another benefit to the Crest of Goneril, which is the ability to use the combat art Apocalyptic Flame when using the crest's associated relic weapon, Freikugel. This provides a massive boost of 15 might on top of the weapon's already formidable 23, as well as a boost of 20 hit. In addition, it deals bonus damage to dragons, and if a target manages to withstand the attack after it lands, they will suffer from a -5 strength debuff for 1 turn. This is obviously an extremely lethal offensive option, the weapon and combat art alone providing a tremendous 38 might, although it does cost 4 of Freikugel's 20 durability, so cannot be used for every occasion, since Freikugel requires Umbral Steel to repair, which can be quite hard to come across. That being said, it is a very nice option to have in the locker when you need a huge hit. On to Hilda's skills, where she has boons in lances and axes, banes in faith and authority, and a budding talent in heavy armour. A very minimal spread of skills which has its ups and downs. Just for the sake of clarity, we will mainly be focusing on the Verdant Wind and Azure Moon iterations of Hilda whenever it's relevant to discussing the context of these, and I will go into more detail on Silver Snow Hilda later in the video, just to make things easier to follow, although it is worth noting that any abilities or combat art she gets from her skills are the same in either case. Let's get the easy one out of the way. The Faith Bane is basically irrelevant. Hilda only has one Faith spell outside of the defaults, and that's Recover, which isn't really anything to write home about. Whilst we are on the topic though, her Reason spell list does have Thorin and Bolting. Whilst I wouldn't usually recommend actually using these with Hilda, the latter of the two does hold some prevalence if you choose to make her your Dancer, since she can keep it equipped whilst using the Dance command to give linked attacks from 10 tiles away to any units with whom she shares a support, including the entire Golden Deer house. Unfortunately, the other Bane in Authority is not so easy to ignore, as it can slow down Hilda from reaching the higher ranks, which she will want to do. Tutoring Hilda here can still be quite productive though, as Byleth will usually have an additional boost from Professor's expertise since they have no problem raising their own authority ranks, and whilst this doesn't completely mitigate the Bane, it does offset it somewhat. The Authority Bane here can cause more issues than it would for many units because typically, Hilda is a unit who will become airborne in flying classes, and the highly beneficial flying battalions typically require higher ranks in this area than some of the grounded options. Despite this area being a Bane, it does give Hilda access to one of the strongest areas of her kit, the ability Battalion Wrath at the C+ rank. This gives a boost of 50 crit when her battalion is at 33% endurance or below, and her opponent initiates combat. This gives her a lot of enemy phase potential in a lot of different build paths, some of which suit her very well. This coming at C+ at least gives some more merit to fighting through the Bane than just better battalions, and means a B rank can be pushed for without it feeling quite as bad. The budding talent in heavy armor is a useful thing for Hilda to have. Mastering this budding talent by tutoring Hilda in this area 12 times grants her access to the ability Seal Speed, which reduces the speed of opponents hit by Hilda by 6 for one turn, which in the early game can be handy for setting up kills, or making enemies less threatening should you find yourself unable to finish them off. This turning into a boon also gives her easier qualification into some potential class options, as well as giving her an easier time reaching the weight -3 ability at C rank, which has the self-explanatory effect of reducing the user's weight by 3, which you may wish to take advantage of, particularly in the early or mid game. Now onto Hilda's boons, lying in axes and lancers, and the biggest draw of these is the amount of classes that this makes it easier for her to access. There are a ton of classes throughout the game which require one or both of these to be able to certify for, and having these to make reaching those thresholds easier is very beneficial. While the classes are the big draw here, there are some merits from the skills granted by the boons too. Lancers allow for Hilda to push for early Tempest Lance, a combat art available at the D rank which provides a boost of 8 might as well as 10 hit. The damage amplifier here is huge for the point in time, so being able to reach this with relative ease is extremely appreciated, since the base E+ rank along with the boon mean that only 60 weapon XP is required to acquire this. Shatter Slash, available at the C+ rank, is a more exclusive skill, and whilst it provides a smaller damage boost, it reduces enemy defense by 5 should the attack land. This can be very useful for softening up tankier targets such as monsters, especially when combined with the aforementioned Seal Speed. Axes will typically be Hilda's primary weapon throughout the game, so the ease of accessing prowesses here is very appreciated just for the additional boosts these provide. At the A rank, Hilda does get access to Diamond Axe, an ability which reduces hit by 20, but to make up for this, offers a huge damage amplifier of 14. This can be a risky ability to use due to the accuracy penalty, but the damage can come in clutch when you need it. That about wraps up the skills. Like I said before, it's fairly minimal, but it does give Hilda some things to work with. As for Hilda's stats, they aren't too bad at all. 10 strength is a great starting point to have, allowing her to hit reasonably hard and can couple as an extra point of speed since it hits the benchmark to offset 2 points of weapon weight instead of just 1. This works nicely with her 8 base speed, which is definitely reasonable, and having a 50% growth in this area means she can avoid being doubled quite a fair amount even in the early game, and being a female means she can potentially access Darting Blow to amp this up later. 6 defense definitely isn't low, but it isn't great either. However, 29 HP is very respectable and stacks her bulk quite nicely, especially when factoring in her aforementioned speed. Another nice area of Hilda's kit is her base 7 charm with a 50% growth, which gives her a reasonable chance of landing and avoiding gambits. Hitting them can be quite relevant in her early game since they can be a very appreciated tool in some tricky situations, and avoiding them can be very useful later on, depending on the build you choose to pursue with Hilda. The one area of Hilda's stat line that can let her down a little is Dex and Luck. These aren't drastically important, but with them both having low to meh bases and the growths for both lacking too, this can cost you some crit chance later in the game, which is something you might feel the effect of to a small degree. Definitely not a big deal at all, and won't be something you worry about to a massive extent, but you would appreciate these being higher. Overall, I think Hilda's stats are a positive area of her kit. They put her in a solid spot for the early game, and that's really what you need out of them. The other thing to note here is that Hilda also has 2 might supports. One with Golden Deer House Leader, Claude, and another with Ashen Wolf, Balthus. This means Hilda gives additional might to these characters when performing a linked attack, and vice versa. It's worth noting that both of these characters are male, so can also benefit from Advocate at the same time, if positioned adjacent to Hilda while she gives the boost, so she can really spike these characters' damage hard. So, with all that said and done, let's take a look at actually using Hilda throughout the course of the game. The thing that would benefit Hilda the most early on is to push that E rank lances up to D in order to take advantage of Tempest Lance, a powerful combat art which increases the might of the attack by 8, a huge spike for this point in the game, whilst also giving an increase of 10 accuracy. With the boon in this area, this should be very easily attainable for Chapter 2 and give her a really nice boost to her damage and kill potential. Taking advantage of Advocate really helps amp up the whole squad's performance, especially early on where the damage it provides is very relevant, so positioning Hilda effectively and bearing in mind how it can be utilised in future turns can make securing kills much easier. This is particularly prevalent on some of the maps that are quite narrow or filled with choke points, such as Chapters 2, 4, and 5. Curved Shot, achieved from D-rank bows, is very desirable here. The boost of 30 hit is always appreciated, as is the boost in range. However, it is particularly noticeable on Hilda as it allows for greater flexibility in her positioning for better use of Advocate, making exploiting the damage boost on more units an easier thing to do. Curved Shot can be attained without too much trouble, and it is advisable to focus on this once Tempest Lance has been acquired. Once Hilda hits level 5, her best beginner class in most situations is Fighter. This provides extra strength whilst in the class, and once it has been mastered, it provides the ability Strength plus 2, which only further amplifies Hilda's damage, as well as giving the combat art Shove. Fighter can be qualified for from Hilda's base thanks to her axe rank, so nothing special needs to be done for her to be able to reach this point. Whilst it may be off-putting due to the Bane in the area, Authority is an important skill for Hilda to raise. Not only does she benefit from the higher rank battalions, which provide access to both better stats and gambits, but also the Battalion Wrath ability at C+, which is extremely desirable. This provides a boost of 50 crit when Hilda's battalion is below 1/3 endurance, providing it isn't completely broken. This is a very powerful enemy phasing tool at a relatively low requirement, even if you do have to fight through a Bane to get there. Another skill that can be worth investing into early is Heavy Armor, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, when the Budding Talent is mastered, it provides Hilda with Seal Speed, which throughout the early game can be a very impactful skill in helping your other units double, or avoid being doubled themselves. Secondly, this makes qualification into Armor Knight at level 10 a possibility, which can be very desirable. This has requirements of C axes and D heavy armor. Whilst Armor Knight is a class you may not want to use in combat, it does provide a very good base defense stat of 12, which is what Hilda's defense will be raised to permanently once she qualifies for it. Whilst I did say you may not want to use it in combat, there is an exception to this, as it can make for a solid early game protection tanking setup by combining it with Battalion Wrath. This can give Hilda a lot of bulk due to the class's +4 defense modifier, and when combined with other defense boosting tools, such as a battalion and a shield, can raise her protection to a very high number, to the point where she takes very little damage from physical attacks, if any at all. This means she can tank the attack from an opponent very comfortably and strike back with a high chance to critically hit for massive damage. During the early stages of the game, you are unlikely to reach 100 crit, but can still get some solid numbers here, and as far as early enemy phase options go, it is better than most, so can definitely be worth exploring. Even now, you can use the Geralt Mercenaries with a Killer Axe for a further spike of crit. A particularly useful application of this is to take out the Thief reinforcements in Chapter 5. It should be kept in mind that there is no real need to master the class, so just break it out when you feel it might help you for a specific fight. One thing to note here is that if you plan on doing this, Soldier might be a better beginner option than Fighter, since mastering the class grants defense +2, giving a small further boost to Hilda's protection. Since you already want to raise lances for Tempest Lance, this isn't out of the way to qualify for either, and can be a very nice way to easily deal with some of the early game challenges where many units can struggle to handle enemy volumes. There can be some consideration to take a quick dip into Thief here, as whilst it doesn't provide a ton of stat boosts for Hilda on average, it will usually give around a +4 boost to Dexterity. Thief requires C swords to guarantee the certification, with it being able to be gambled at D+, and whilst I wouldn't recommend going for this purely for the additional points of dex, if you reach this requirement anyway since you are raising the skill for other reasons which will be touched on later, you might as well jump into it for the free stats. As for classes that Hilda will want to master here, Archer is definitely the pick of the litter, which has a guaranteed promotion at C bows or it can be gambled a little lower at D+. Firstly, it's a strong class to run at this point in time anyway, due to its innate ability Bow Range +1, which provides an additional point of range whenever a bow is used. Secondly, the class mastery ability is Hit +20, which has the self-explanatory effect of increasing the hit of all attacks by 20, including gambits, which can be a huge boost to consistency. Pegasus Knight is another great class at this point in time. Its requirements are C Lancers and D Flying, the former of which holds a boon for Hilda, and the latter is a low requirement in an area that she is likely to want to raise for later class requirements and build options. Having access to 6 move, flight, and canto at this stage in the game is very nice, and the class performs excellently in combat at this point in the game. Its mastery ability is Darting Blow, which is definitely an ability where your mileage may vary depending on what route you want to take Hilda down. This provides +6 speed when the unit initiates combat, which can give Hilda some solid doubling potential, particularly in the mid-game. However, depending on the build you choose to pursue later in the game, this may fall heavily out of relevance, to the point where you may end up not using it at all. Either way though, Pegasus Knight is such a strong option as an intermediate class that it is definitely worth using, regardless of whether or not you end up mastering the class. Brigand is another consideration for a class to master at the intermediate stage, and with its only requirement being a C in axes, Hilda's starting rank and boon in this area will let her reach this with ease. The ability you get for mastering this is Death Blow, which grants +6 damage when the user initiates combat, which can be a very appreciated damage spike. However, whether or not this is worth doing can vary based on your build, similarly to Darting Blow, as you may end up dropping it in the long run. Another issue is that Brigand just isn't a great class at this point. It's nothing awful, but Archer and Pegasus Knight definitely outshine it. Deciding whether or not you want to go into this will depend on what you want to do with Hilda in the future. As for what those future options are, Hilda has a plethora of enemy phase builds she can go into. I'm going to start with one that is not her best option, but I do think has some merit, and that's revisiting the earlier mentioned idea of protection tanking. I'll be transparent here and just be clear that I find this incredibly entertaining, so whilst it doesn't quite measure up to some of her other classes, I still find it a lot of fun. That isn't to say there aren't some practical benefits too though. If you choose to pursue this throughout the game, the concept remains basically the same as it was earlier. You stack as much protection as you can onto a unit through class choices, shields, battalions, abilities, etc. in order to basically get a unit to take very little if any damage from physical attacks. By combining this with Vantage Wrath, you are then able to hit back with a crit after tanking the initial attack to wipe out the enemy in a single blow. Whilst, as mentioned before, early on it's tough to get 100 crit to guarantee this eases as the game progresses, with much more tools such as better battalions and easier access to Killer Axe pluses becoming available. Like was mentioned earlier, you can start protection tanking much earlier than other enemy phase options. As soon as Hilda hits level 10, you can go into Armor Knight and you are basically good to go. From here, you can move into Fortress Knight in the late game, which can be reached without too much trouble, since once the Budding Talent is mastered, Hilda has boons in both areas required, so the requirements of B Axes and B Heavy Armor can be met easily, or you can gamble them a little lower if you prefer. Since the requirements for Fortress Knight are very attainable, it leaves Hilda relatively free to invest in anything else she may want. This includes investing more heavily into axes for earlier access to higher level prowesses, and potentially axe crit +10 at the S rank, which increases her crit chance when using axes by 10, providing obvious benefits to a build such as this. Authority is another obvious goal to allow her access to better battalions. Of course, you can always not invest further into Hilda at all and sink this investment into other units instead, which is still a very nice option to have. If you choose to go for this, you probably want a battalion that boosts crit and protection, with a boost to hit also being helpful. On top of this, you probably want to avoid the A ranks due to the Bane and Authority. With this in mind, the Leicester Mercenaries, Goneril Valkyries, or Fraldarius Soldiers are all solid options at B Authority. You might still be concerned about reaching this, but since enemy phase units see so much combat, all of which grant Authority XP, it isn't as daunting of a task as it may seem, especially when protection tanks can enemy phase from such an early point in the game and you already want C+ Authority for Battalion Wrath. You can also still attack on the player phase with this, a prime option being to use Smash with a Killer Axe, giving a high crit chance to wipe out enemies such as Gambit users who won't be killed on the enemy phase. Whilst the crit and therefore the kill probably won't be guaranteed, the defense will still be in full effect, so you can just eat the counterattack if the crit doesn't occur. Speaking of gambits, Hilda's charm is a great asset in helping her to avoid them when she gets targeted with them by the enemies. One of the big advantages of this build is that the tools that are used to boost protection, such as shields, are seldom contested, so she should have a completely free pick to take whatever she will need in this regard. This includes limited options such as the Aegis shields, which provides a boost of +6. Similarly, any defense boosting stat boosters you find throughout the game are also usually easy for her to claim, and she won't see much competition from other units for these. If you want, you can also opt to push for Great Knight later in the game, which is a master class requiring B+ axes and riding and A heavy armor to guarantee the promotion. It isn't really strictly better than Fortress Knight, more of a sideways move, trading 2 protection for 3 move, which is by far the biggest drawback of the prot tanks, especially in Fortress Knight. Limited move can greatly limit Hilda's positioning options, as well as cause issues with her keeping up with combat in general. Great Knight also grants Canto, further expanding positioning options. This does provide a lot of benefits, however its requirements are very steep. Another big issue with this is the rather obvious problem of dealing with enemies who don't deal in physical damage. Mages can be very troublesome, since there isn't much you can do to bump up the resistance. This usually means avoiding mages or dealing with them on the player phase, either with Hilda herself or your other units. This isn't usually anything too disastrous, but it is another obstacle you have to navigate, which isn't really as present in other builds. If you did want to explore this option of enemy phasing, you can be quite flexible with your skills. Battalion Wrath, Hit +20 and Axe Prowess will usually be staples, but past that you have options. Death Blow, Defensive Tactics, Strength +2, Defense +2, Axe Crit +10, Lancebreaker, and potentially more are all viable to fill out your build. You can also make use of other things, such as using a Retribution Gambit with another unit to allow Hilda to counterattack from any range. Overall, whilst this definitely has its flaws, there are upsides to it too, and I think it's worth consideration. On to another option Hilda has for enemy phasing, which is dodge tanking. This, put simply, involves raising the unit's avoid as high as possible so that they dodge any attacks that come their way, and then striking back with a crit that, similar to the previous enemy phase build, is fueled by Battalion Wrath. This is somewhat similar to protection tanking, but the focus is on avoid rather than protection, which brings with it some very important, very key distinctions. To inflate avoid in this way, you want to make use of abilities, battalions, equipment, and classes that all boost this area. Due to the ability Avoid +10, the flying classes make for a natural endgame here, which is always nice due to the strength of these classes anyway, thanks to their high move, flight, and canto. The only issue with this is that the stronger flying battalions, notably the Keyhole Wyvern Co, are both high investment at A Authority and highly contested by other units. If you have the DLC, the Secret Transport Force can be a nice alternative here at B Authority, since it provides 15 avoid, with the Galatea Pegasus Co being another option. The Wyvern Lord class here is a great choice, and I personally prefer it to Falcon Knight. This requires an A in Axes and Flying and a C in Lances. Hilda's boon in Axes allow her to reach the requirement in that area very easily, and the same goes for Lancers, which may have already been met if you certified for Pegasus Knight earlier. It also has a nice bridge in Wyvern Rider at an advanced level, which will help boost her flying rank a little quicker, as well as being a high performance class at the time, albeit without that all important Avoid +10. When in the Master class, Axe Fair, providing +5 damage to attacks with axes, is a great asset thanks to the high damage of the weapon type making them already desirable, and obviously Avoid +10 is extremely beneficial. One of the primary tools for pumping up Avoid on the enemy phase is Alert Stance Plus, which is available at A+ Flying. This grants a boost of 30 Avoid when the unit ends their turn with the Wait command. The boost of Avoid is very nice and one of the best ways to guarantee the dodge, however its cost is very steep. Ending your turn with the Wait command essentially means you can't attack on the player phase, meaning you can't use this to deal with enemies such as Gambit users or Ballista without losing that massive chunk of Avoid. It's worth noting that prior to Alert Stance Plus, you do get regular Alert Stance at B Flying, which is similar but only provides 15 Avoid rather than 30. Personally, I don't really think this is worth using, since 15 Avoid isn't too big of a gain for the cost of your entire player phase action, but if you really want to get the dodge tanking rolling early, it can help out, although it may still be inconsistent here, especially since none of the advanced classes have Avoid +10, and you may also be lacking the prowess skills higher ranks. This can leave you with a final build of Axe Prowess, Hit +20, Battalion Wrath, Alert Stance Plus, and the last spot can be a little more flexible, with Axe Crit +10 being the most desirable choice, although with this not being unlocked until the S Axe rank, it may be a while until you get there, so until then, Lancebreaker, Strength +2 and others can be a reasonable temporary option. In terms of weaponry and equipment, you are probably looking at a Killer Axe Plus with an Evasion Ring. So, what are the pros and cons of this? Well, one of the biggest benefits of dodge tanking is that it's a high movement option that, outside of hitting them with a Retribution Gambit using another unit, requires basically no setup once you are in the map. You can throw Hilda basically anywhere and she is free to go to town on enemies from the first enemy phase. The high move also makes it easier to reposition from turn to turn, as well as flight, limiting the chance that you will get boxed in by enemies such as Gambit users. Speaking of Gambits, Hilda's high charm once again aids her in avoiding these, which is a great boost to her survivability. In fact, the build in general is very safe, since even on the off chance something goes wrong and you have to eat an attack, you still have a full HP bar with which to take it, and unlike protection tanking, you don't have a glaring weakness to magic-based opponents. Although it must be said bows might take quite a chunk, they do still have to hit you first. On the other hand, the build does take quite a long time to fully come online, requiring A+ flying for Alert Stance Plus and the level 30 classes for Avoid plus 10, which can leave the middle portion of the game a little awkward, with Hilda being a role player during this point in time, or going for risky enemy phases with the Avoid being lower than desired, particularly prior to Alert Stance Plus. Hilda can still contribute at this time, particularly in the Wyvern Rider class, but not to her fullest extent, either being limited to sketchy enemy phasing, or flying around on a Wyvern bonking things with Brave Axes, Freikugel and such. I wouldn't necessarily say this is a high investment. A+ flying, B Authority and Wyvern Lord isn't anything earth-shattering, it's just that it takes a while. I have already discussed the impact of losing the player phase, which is very unfortunate. However, it should be noted that although this build is not in any way catered to player phasing, if you do need to act here in a pinch, you are still able to, you just lose the avoid granted by Alert Stance Plus. Whilst you will likely be missing tools such as Death Blow, smacking something with Apocalyptic Flame will often still be enough to see an opponent off, especially with Axe Fair backing it up, and things such as Brave Axes or Smash with a Killer Axe will also be able to contribute, although with the latter it will probably be far from guaranteed to crit due to the battalions that are likely available not providing a huge boost, and the former two require weapons that can be quite costly to repair and maintain. Another potential issue is that raising crit, hit, and avoid all to the necessary levels can require quite a lot of resources, some of which compete with each other. For example, you cannot run both an evasion and a crit ring, so must trade off in one of these areas. Similarly, your battalion will likely be a choice between the three stats. Personally, I would focus on prioritising avoid here, since it has the biggest failure consequence. Getting hit results in a potential death, whereas missing or just not critting leaves the enemy alive for another turn. That about wraps up dodge tanking, which has both some clear positives as well as some obvious drawbacks. However, we aren't done talking about enemy phase builds quite yet, and there is one more method we need to discuss. This involves making use of the ability Vantage, which is obtained from the Mercenary class at an intermediate level. Mercenary requires C swords to guarantee qualification, or it can be gambled at D+, so it isn't hard to reach at all. This is also where classing into Thief becomes more viable. Vantage allows the user to attack first when they are below 50% HP and their opponent initiates combat. There are two skills you can choose to utilise to really maximise it. The first is Battalion Wrath, which has already been covered quite a lot in this video. The second is its regular variant, Wrath. This provides the same boost of 50 crit when the opponent initiates combat, however rather than going off of Battalion Endurance, it has the same activation clause as Vantage, requiring less than 50% HP. Wrath is acquired from mastering the advanced class, Warrior, which has a requirement of A axes. There are ups and downs to both of these. Going with Battalion Wrath means you can get this online much earlier, since it becomes an option as soon as you master Mercenary. It also means you don't have to spend time in Warrior, which for an advanced level is quite an underwhelming class compared to something like Wyvern Rider. On the other hand, having to take damage to activate Vantage will damage your battalion, and over time it will break, meaning you will have to trade battalions in and out, which I find to be very annoying, as well as meaning that for some of the time you will not have the best choice of battalion on Hilda. It's worth noting that you can always use Battalion Wrath up until you reach Warrior, at which point you can use the battalion variant to unlock the regular alternative. This is even easier if you choose to do Orcs battles, since you can just master Warrior there and not have to use it during the actual maps. You can also use both of these together if you choose, for a massive boost of 100 crit. Once you have nabbed Wrath, you will likely want to switch back over to the flying classes, finishing on Wyvern Lord for the same reasons we discussed earlier. As for how this compares to other enemy phase methods, the one big advantage it has is that it only requires you to invest resources into two areas once you have the necessary skills, hit and crit, whereas protection tanking and dodge tanking require a third investment area in protection and avoid respectively. This not only saves resources for other units, but also makes it much easier to get Hilda to be more reliable and consistent on her enemy phase. It also has no restrictions on its player phase, unlike dodge tanking, so you are free to make use of tools there to pick up some additional kills. On the negative side of things, it requires in-map setup in order to activate Vantage and the regular variant of Wrath, which means you have to factor this into your pathing and movement in order to get that enemy phase active as soon as possible. Being at low health for these skills to activate also makes things a little less safe if things go wrong, such as a miss or not getting a crit, since Hilda is much more likely to fall in combat from the ensuing counterattack. It also requires an additional class mastery in Mercenary, potentially 2 if you want the regular variant of Wrath, which increases the cost of entry for this. If this was your enemy phase build of choice, you can go with a skill set of Vantage, one of the Wraths, Hit plus 20, Axe Prowess, and Axe Crit plus 10. Once again, you can use a rotational or filler option for the final slot, such as Death Blow, Strength plus 2, Lance Breaker, or Defensive Tactics, the latter of which may be something you want to keep around for the long term if you are going for Battalion Wrath over the regular alternative, since it can allow you to keep your battalion whilst getting chunked down. Finally, we have reached the end of enemy phase builds. All of these have their own merits and flaws, and I think there is a reason to go with any of them depending on your situation. You could also opt for a player phase Hilda variant if you wanted, but there isn't really too much to say about this. There aren't any special tools that Hilda gets here, and most of the time it's just a case of flying around and hitting things with brave weapons or combat arts with big numbers. The only difference would be running things like Death and Darting Blow. Before we wrap things up here, we do have to discuss Hilda on Silver Snow, where she can be recruited on Chapter 12 after siding with the Church. There are some pretty big issues here which are prevalent from the get-go, mainly that her only ranks that are off of the E baseline are Lances and Axes, both of which are only at C+. It might seem odd that she joins in the intermediate class Brigand despite coming at level 23, but she actually doesn't have the ranks to qualify for any of the advanced classes at base, even with a gamble. You're probably still going to want to grab Hit plus 20, and then I think your best bet is getting Battalion Wrath and going for either the Vantage or Fortress Knight builds to go for a low investment late game option. It's not going to be anything spectacular, but it will probably work to a fairly reasonable degree. It will just come online rather late in either scenario due to the investment required to reach the builds, thanks to the low starting point. If you want to get the most out of Hilda, I would recommend making use of her in one of the other routes where she is available, but should you opt to use her in Silver Snow, just aim for a low investment option and try to get her contributing as quickly as possible. I think that about wraps up Hilda. I hope this helps you to get the most out of her in your future playthroughs. I would once again like to thank the people who have backed the channel on Patreon. Your support is greatly appreciated. When this goes live, the poll on there for the next unit to be released will have 24 hours remaining on it, so if you want to get involved and have your say, you can still do so for just £1 a month. A link is in the description. If you want to discuss this video, the channel, or Fire Emblem in general, consider joining the Discord. Thanks for watching.